Hey, all right. Welcome back. Chapter 3, Lecture 2. You've been learning a little bit about synapses and how one neuron communicates with another. I'm going to talk about that a little bit here, but I'm going to add a different spin to it. So I'm going to reconnect it. And this is what I'm going to try to do every now and then through my lectures is try to take something you've already learned and then add more to it, build on the story a little bit. So let's jump in here. Synapses and drugs, lecture 3.2. And I want to connect it back to this. Do you remember when we were talking about the difference between psychiatrists versus psychologists in terms of how they interact and try to support mental health? One of the things, by the way, I should highlight before we go too far is one of the first things we figure out when somebody is facing some mental health challenge is whether it's more appropriate for them to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Certain issues seem to work better in terms of therapy, and other issues we really want to have that more psychiatric kind of thing, especially at the outset. And of course, all that relates to the famous distinction between the two, that because psychiatrists are first medical doctors, they can prescribe medication. Psychologists cannot. Psychologists do what they do through therapies, and you're going to learn a little of those therapies as we go through. Many of them are very scientifically based and shown to be effective, but invariably the therapies are slower acting. They're teaching people new skills, new ways of being, and that takes a while. And so sometimes the need is urgent. And the classic example of this would be somebody in a deep depression who is seriously considering harming themselves. For a person who's in that situation, therapy may be too slow, and we may want to use some medicinal or drug approach to first of all get them feeling okay. And then maybe we can bring in therapy and hope that the therapy will get them through the long term. So I've said that before. I've said that's the sort of ultimate thing. If we're using drugs, to use them short term, and then hopefully to wean the person away from the drugs and instead to lean more heavily on therapy. In this lecture, you're going to find out a little bit more why that makes sense, why drug approaches are not the be-all and end-all. Okay, what are some of the problems with a purely medicinal approach to mental health disorders? Okay, medicine, drugs, different ways of talking about the same thing. Medicine sounds more nice. Drug sounds more dark. Medicines are drugs. Okay, so we're really going to focus on what happens here at the synapse between neurons. And so, as we look at this and just, to get a good sense of, I had to look at this for a second, and I should have challenged you. I should have said which one of these is sending the signal and which one is receiving. I put it on there, but I shouldn't have. I feel bad. Bad boy. Shouldn't have done that. I should have just left them unlabeled and let you think about it. Because when you look, you can see a lot of what's going on when you actually have to stop and think about it. And when you look here, you kind of can tell, oh, hang on, these little droplets of stuff, and this is a neurotransmitter. It's a drug that the sending neuron releases. So we're at the axon terminal of the sending neuron, and it has these neurotransmitters within it. And when it's stimulated, when an action potential comes down that neuron, it stimulates a reaction at this membrane, which results in the release of these neurotransmitters into this area, which we call the synaptic cleft. Or the synapse. Sometimes we just call it the synapse. The important point here, the interesting point, is that neurons do not directly touch each other. They have this gap in between, and the way a signal gets across this gap is through these neurotransmitters, which leave here, and as you see here, they bind to the dendrites of the receiving neuron. Okay, there are very specifically shaped gates. And think of it almost like a lock, and the neurotransmitter, the chemical structure of that neurotransmitter is a key that kind of fits in to that lock. And so these dendrites are sensitive to a certain kind of neurotransmitter. And when that gets released, it binds. These are the terms we use. Binds to the dendrites, which causes a reaction here. Okay. And so if this was an excitatory neuron, the sending, then the reaction it would cause would be one where it's going to kind of push this neuron to fire, to consider firing. So it's going to increase that voltage, right? From that original negative voltage, it's going to increase the voltage. If this was an inhibitory neuron, then the signal would be an inhibitory one. So it would actually decrease the voltage. It would be kind of influencing this neuron not to fire. Okay, but the interesting thing is, of course, that these neurotransmitters have to get across this gap, and then after they get across the gap, and after they do their thing, then there's this process called reuptake that happens, where the neurotransmitters are essentially recycled. They go back into the sending neurons axon terminal, where they can be reconstituted and used again. And so it's literally a release of these things that stimulate this neuron, and then a pullback or a reuptake of those neurotransmitters that come in. Okay. The reason we are sensitive to drugs of any kind is because when we take a drug, and if that drug can get through the blood-brain barrier to the brain, then it can affect what happens here. And in fact, the drugs that have an effect on us do so by affecting this process in some way. And there's a variety of ways. Some drugs are like the neurotransmitter. So they have that same sort of shape. So even though, in fact, this neuron is not sending anything, if we have this drug that can get into the synaptic cleft, it can bind to the dendrites and it can act as though, or stimulate the same response as would happen if this sent something. So if we think somebody doesn't have enough of some neurotransmitter, one of the things we can do is give them a drug that simulates that neurotransmitter and makes the brain respond as though it were there. By the way, just to tell you a more complex one, and the one that's very common in, say, depression. Depression has they have what they are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. Those are the common drugs used with depression. Selective serotonin, so they're going to only target neurons that release serotonin, and they're going to be reuptake inhibitors. So they're going to inhibit reuptake. There's a lot in that. But what it means is, if this was releasing serotonin, it would release serotonin and stimulate the dendrite. Normally, it would then reuptake all the serotonin. But these drugs inhibit that reuptake process. And so what happens is it releases the serotonin, and then the serotonin stays out there longer than it normally would because the reuptake is inhibited. So it's kind of hanging around out there, continuing to stimulate this neuron. And it's almost as if there's more serotonin now, more being released. And that serotonin can lead to positive mood states. And so if it seems like there's more, then that person will feel better. Okay? So, really interesting. We are electrochemical machines, as I've mentioned a lot of times, and we've seen all the microvoltage, all the electrical part of that. But this is the chemical part of that. Everything is driven by chemicals, and therefore we can take external chemicals, and it affects how this system works. Okay, so let's talk about that in a little more detail, though. It is cool. We can produce the desired effects that we want with some of these drugs, but there are a couple of problems. So one is drug tolerance, drug addiction, and drug anticipation. We're going to talk about that. So you can become addicted to these drugs. How does that happen? What's the process? We'll talk about that a little bit. Also, the issue is all of these drugs produce side effects. So they produce the effects we want, but they also produce other effects that we don't want. And so this makes them really tricky. So, I've harped on this many times. While drug treatments can produce the immediate relief for some mental health issues, these two issues, the idea of tolerance and side effects, make them problematic as a long-term solution. We still use them as a long-term solution, don't get me wrong, but these are the problems, these are the challenges of using drugs as a long-term solution, and anybody that's on any sort of medicine of this sort will know these challenges well. So let's talk about them one at a time. Drug tolerance, addiction, and anticipation. Who's this guy? John Belushi, actor in the film Animal House, so in the 80s, I believe. have to test my knowledge now, 70s, 80s, somewhere around there. John Belushi was a very, very well-known comedian from Saturday Night Live. He was on Ghostbusters and all sorts of things. He was very well-known. He was also kind of known as a party kind of animal, which is what he played in Animal House. And this is a picture of him from Animal House. Doesn't look very attractive, especially with all the crap on his sweater. Goodness knows what that is. He was sort of the poster child for a lot of these drug issues because he died of a drug overdose and did so in a sort of interesting way. Let me get to that. But let's just talk about this. So first of all, any drug that has its effect does so by mimicking naturally occurring neurotransmitters. So cocaine affects the dopamine system. Every drug affects some system in the brain that is built around a neurotransmitter. And so these drugs either act like the neurotransmitter, or they block the neurotransmitter, they prevent it from having an effect, or they do things like that SSRI I told you about, where they actually mess with the system in a way that keeps the neurotransmitters around longer. But this is why drugs affect us, is because our system communicates through the use of chemicals. And so external chemicals can mess everything up. Okay. Now here's an important thing. The brain is an extremely dynamic organ. When we take an external drug, so if an external drug is repeatedly taken, in some context, the brain learns to expect that drug and responds by reducing the amount of associated neurotransmitter, and the degree of this response increases with each exposure. There's a lot in that. This is the basis of tolerance. So the idea here is, and let's take John Belushi. So let's say, at the end of a day of doing his comedy thing, John Belushi would go home, sit on his couch, and start taking some drugs. Whatever drugs he took, let's say he was taking cocaine. Normally the brain would produce dopamine, which sort of has the same effect as cocaine, sort of making you feel, awake, alert, active, ready to go. So that's the sort of amphetamine kind of response. But if you are taking cocaine, the very first time you take it, you will get a big, powerful feeling, right? Because you've got all of the brain's dopamine is still there and you've added cocaine to it. And so it's really, really, really like, wow. But then if you take it again and again in that same situation, the brain starts to know what's going on. It's like, oh, you're about to take cocaine. And it responds by reducing, in this case, the amount of dopamine it's producing. So the context literally triggers the brain to stop producing dopamine. This, by the way, leads to cravings, right? As soon as the drug user gets into that setting, they really want the cocaine because they like that feeling of cocaine. And when the dopamine gets pulled back, it's like the opposite of that feeling. And so they want the cocaine really, really badly then, more than they even did that first time. And so now they'll take cocaine again. It won't get them as high the second time because now the brain has pulled back on its production of dopamine. And every time you use it in that situation, this cycle repeats. The brain produces less and less dopamine. The drug user starts to really anticipate and crave that drug when they're getting up to the time and the situation when they normally use it. And when they actually take the drug, it has less of an effect. Quite often, in fact, for somebody that's used a drug a lot, it just sort of brings them back to normal. They barely feel the cocaine high anymore. It's more like they need the cocaine just to be normal now because their brain has stopped producing the dopamine that it normally would. That's the key of addiction and tolerance, because what the person then does is ups their dose of cocaine. Right. And this happens, we talk about it in the cocaine situation, but also somebody who's taking a medicine for some mental health issue. What they often find is that medicine works well at first, but then it stops working so well. And then you have to up the dose. And so you have to keep cranking up the dose to get the same effect. Sometimes you have to change drugs because it's just the dose is getting too dangerous. And so somebody has to change to some other drug that the brain hasn't learned yet and start the process over again. And so this is one of the problems with drug treatments is that the brain does not just statically respond to the drug. You can't just top up liquids like you can in a car. A little more oil. The brain reacts to what you're giving it, and it reacts against it. It does the opposite, and that causes all these addictions and such. Yeah, so there's tolerance addictions. You need higher and higher doses to produce the desired effects. And if you do not get a dose, now you feel those intense cravings, aka you feel addicted to that drug. And you can have physiological side effects, some physiological behaviors that go with that. There's a really interesting aspect to this. And I mentioned that the strength of this is different for different drugs, and the reaction is often triggered by the drug use and context. So let's go slowly over this. The strength of this is different for different drugs. So things like marijuana that are out there now, we know that marijuana does not, this sort of cycle does not happen as quickly as it does for other drugs. Morphine, it happens very quickly. And morphine's a really nasty drug to become addicted to, because the neurotransmitters associated with morphine, they help us in situations when there's pain. They help us sort of counter the feelings of pain. And so imagine now that you've been taking morphine, and so your brain stops producing its natural form of that. If you ever don't have morphine, if you were ever in this situation where you cannot get your drug, then you have the cravings, but you also now are very sensitive to pain. Walking on the floor could hurt your feet, because you don't have the natural neurotransmitter that would help you do that. You've been relying on this artificial version. And so morphine withdrawal can be extreme because of that, because the person now is feeling this intense pain of all sorts, the opposite of the beautiful feeling they had when they were on morphine. They feel absolutely horrible, and therefore they really want that morphine bad, and they will often do anything to get it. Okay. So different drugs, this kicks into different levels. Certain drugs are much more addictive than others. And now here's this interesting thing. So if we come back to the story of John Belushi, people were puzzled by the story of John Belushi. He was doing what they called speedballs, which was a mixture of morphine and cocaine. Yeah. So he did this to party, I guess. And he would often do this, and he would often do this in a very specific situation, very specific context. The day he died, he was in a very different context, one where he does not usually use these drugs. And the important point of that, but it was the same amount of drug he'd used many times. So that was the puzzling thing. People were saying, well, why did he die? He's done this amount of drug many, many times. He died because his brain wasn't expecting the drug in that context. It was expecting a different context. So in that other context, the brain naturally pulls back all of its natural morphine and cocaine type neurotransmitters. And therefore you need that drug just to kind of get back to a reasonable spot. But in this new situation, the brain had never associated that with drug use. It had never been drug use. And so it had some of its natural morphine and cocaine-like neurotransmitters there. And then John added this big external amount. This big external amount that's big because he had, reached such a deep level of tolerance. And now the combination of that external drug with the natural brain neurotransmitters was too much. And that's what brought him to this lethal dose and that killed him. Okay, so they now use this, by the way, in hospitals. When they give morphine, they will sometimes move patients around from rooms and give them the morphine in different rooms to try to reduce this tolerance so that the patient can tolerate the morphine longer, because it's the morphine that's keeping them away from the pain of the cancer. Okay, so the big picture from all this first part is that the brain is dynamic. And it reacts to external drugs by changing the way it does things. And that leads to tolerance, and addiction leads to the need for larger and larger doses over time. That's one of the problems of drug treatments. Here's the other problem. Let's take a specific neurotransmitter. Let's say serotonin. What this is showing is all of the various areas of the brain that are sensitive to serotonin. These are all the areas where neurons are releasing serotonin into those synaptic clefts, into these sorts of things, doing their things. And they're all over the brain. Now, if we have a specific issue, let's say it's an emotion issue, let's say it's to do with depression, it's probably these parts of the brain that this is the emotional, you'll learn a little bit, the limbic system kind of area. This is where most of our emotional regulation is happening, and it's probably these systems where we would like to do those SSRIs, right? Those let's keep the serotonin around here because then the person will feel happier. And it'll probably work. But here's the problem. All of these other areas are also being affected by the drug. So you're not just increasing the amount of serotonin in that part of the brain, you're increasing the amount of serotonin potentially in every part of the brain that is influenced by serotonin. This gives rise to side effects. So when we take the drug, we get the effect we want, but we also get a bunch of other effects because the brain uses these neurotransmitters all through the brain. So a specific neurotransmitter, it's not specific to a specific part of the brain. Every neurotransmitter is used in multiple parts of the brain. And when you mess with that neurotransmitter, you mess with it in all parts of the brain that it affects. And so this means that very often, we get a bunch of other effects that can be very problematic. So, to give you an example, in some of the schizophrenia drugs that will help schizophrenics to avoid all of their delusions and all that, all the sort of crazy parts of schizophrenia, we have drugs that can prevent that, but those drugs also impact sexual behavior. You cannot function anymore, and you might not be surprised that some patients aren't happy about that. So some patients will not stay on their meds for that reason. And so this becomes tricky. If the medication gives rise to a bunch of side effects, many of them lead to weight gain, for example, as a side effect. If the side effects are really undesirable, then it's hard to get the patient to stay on the medicine because they don't like all of these side effects. Okay, so that's the other problem with drugs. Addiction, tolerance, and it gives rise to all these side effects. Now, there is a whole area of research called psychopharmacology. Psychopharmacology focuses on the drugs that affect our mind, our brain, and often the big sort of issue, what they're trying to do there is make these drugs more targeted, make them so that they do affect the systems you want and that they don't affect the other systems as much, thereby resulting in fewer side effects. That's the sort of goal. Okay, so, as we've gone through all this now, sorry. I just wanted to give you a little bit more. I forgot I had this slide. This is just to show you, I've been kind of talking about SSRIs and depression throughout here as my sort of pet, drug treatment of doing this. And so I just wanted to show you some of the side effects that are associated with that. And you see, they're pretty, imagine you're having to deal with all of these side effects, including, insomnia, headaches, low sex drive, dizziness, blah, blah, blah. You're not depressed anymore. That's good. But you have all of these other things going on. You don't want to keep taking those drugs if you can avoid it. If you can get off the drugs and go to a more treatment approach, then that's, preferable. Cool. All right, so that's it for this part. Again, the idea here was just to give you a better sense of what's going on in that synaptic cleft, but also the importance that plays in terms of making us so sensitive to drugs, which can be a good thing because we do use these drugs medicinally. They do help us at times, but every time we do, we have to worry about potentials of addictions, tolerance, and the side effects that the drugs cause. That's what makes them not the preferred option for a long-term solution, especially because tolerance keeps building. So you have to keep upping doses and all that kind of such. And that's why we would love to transition somebody who has mental health challenges from a drug-based treatment early on to something that's much more therapeutic. Okay, cool. Thank you. See you in the next lecture. Have a good one.